I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss reports that the US has offered air and intelligence support to a post-war force in Ukraine, the impact of strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure, and the latest twist in the ongoing saga of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline back in 2022.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 27th of August, 3 years and 186 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. First, over to Dom for the latest military developments.
Well, thanks, Francis. Let's dial straight into the front line in the east of Ukraine. Slight Russian advances across a number of areas. They've advanced about 5 k's to the north and northeast of Liman. Very small, very slight, but it's happened, so we're bringing it to you. Further down in the Donbass, Ukrainian forces continue to pressurise that push that Russia made east and northeast of Dobropia. Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevets says that Russia's 51st Combined Arms Army that was operating there, however, does seem to have reverted back to its original mission, which seems to be attacking Pokrovsk directly, the city directly, having failed to consolidate and expand that push north. So they are, to some degree, still there. They've been nibbled away by numerous Ukrainian counterattacks. It's nothing like what it was a couple of weeks ago, but they do still hold some land there to the east and northeast of Dobropia. Elsewhere, Russian forces seem to be a couple of kilometres inside Dnipropetrovsk Oblast for, we think, probably pretty much the first time, right down in the border area where Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk Oblasts meet. Active fighting is ongoing in the region, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces have said, and we think it might be the first time Russia has taken control of any settlements and seemingly held them. There have been some sort of reconnaissance efforts, dashes across and plant a flag, take a photo kind of thing, but we think they're a couple of kilometres inside and have taken a couple of the areas there. General Staff said in a statement, the Ukrainian Defence Forces have stopped the advance of the Russian invaders and continue to control the village of Zaporizhia, despite all the efforts of Russia or the Russian forces who are trying to capture the settlement. They say active hostilities are also ongoing in the area of the village of Novohurivka. Now that area is equidistant between Zaporizhia and Donetsk cities, about 100 kilometres from each, east and west. Yesterday, Ukrainian forces brought down 74 of the 95 drones fired at them. The Energy Ministry said Russian drones attacked energy and gas transmission infrastructure in the Sumy, Poltava, Donetsk, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Zaporizhia oblasts. And there were other Russian attacks, glide bombs, artillery, etc., across Sumy, Poltava, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Kherson oblasts. In total, 2 people killed, 30 wounded. Now, if we go slightly outside the country, in the latest attack on Russian energy infrastructure, there was an explosion yesterday at the Ryazan-Moscow oil pipeline. This is said to be a key petroleum supply route for Moscow. This is a source in the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence department, speaking anonymously to the Kyiv Independent. Now, local media in Russia reported a powerful fire near the village of Bozhetkovo. That's on the outskirts of Ryazan, about 100 kilometres southeast of Moscow last night. Russian Telegram channels lit up and reported loud blast could be heard in the vicinity of the pipeline. Then speaking this morning, the HUR source said that as a result of, quote, the powerful explosion, the transportation of petroleum products to Moscow via the pipeline has been suspended indefinitely. I guess we can't verify this report, but we could probably assess that something has happened there. We could probably assess that the transportation of the petrol products has been suspended. I don't think we can append the word indefinitely to it, unless it's a much bigger blast than seems to have been reported. Anyway, the cause of the explosion was not specified by that source. Just for background, since 2018, that pipeline has been repurposed by Transneft, the Russian state-run pipeline operator, to supply gasoline products to Moscow, mainly for civilian cars. Now, we know the company also supplies fuel to the Russian military, but don't know if this particular pipeline did. It won't help in any way the queues that we've been reporting on and that we've seen lately, queues for fuel for civilian cars, and the tension, indeed some of the fights we've seen on social media among the public trying to get their hands on fuel. Now, possibly as a result of these ongoing challenges to get fuel to the public, Reuters said yesterday that Russia has increased its August crude oil export plans from ports in the west of the country, increasing them by 200,000 barrels a day. I said yesterday, you may remember, that according to Reuters' own data and their own calculations, Ukraine struck 10 refineries in Russia throughout August, shutting down facilities representing 17% of Russia's national processing capacity, or the equivalent of 1.1 million barrels a day. So it continues. A couple more for me, looking outside Ukraine, Russia now. Today is Moldova's Independence Day. Happy Independence Day if you're listening to or from Moldova. The leaders of France, Germany and Poland are expected to be in the country today, visiting President Maia Sandu to demonstrate support ahead of the start of the parliamentary election campaign. AFP are reporting this. The visit comes amid what the Moldovan presidency describes as Russia ramping up its, quote, interference activities ahead of the high-stakes elections, which are due in September. Now, Ms Sandu's pro-EU Party of Action and Solidarity face a challenge from the pro-Russian Socialist Party and its allies in the upcoming election. France has conducted an interview with one of the opposition party leaders, is that right?
I interviewed a member of the governing party in Moldova, Maia Sandu's party, as well as opposition figures who are pretty closely affiliated with the Russians, and that was the protest that we saw, which we played in an episode a few weeks ago. Yeah,
this was a couple of weeks ago, probably 3 or 4 weeks actually, so you'll be able to...
We'll link to that in the show notes if you like.
So France 24 saying that the 3 EU leaders are going to give a press statement alongside Ms Sandu this afternoon, then have a fancy dinner tonight. They're going to give speeches during the official Independence Day celebrations held on Chisinau's Independence Square, then a big old concert tonight. Macron, Merz and Tusk want to reaffirm their support for Moldova's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity, a French presidential advisor told journalists. They also want to support Moldova's European trajectory, we are told. And then finally for me, a story that I saw in the last hour. We've got it on our website. The BBC have got it as well, probably be elsewhere. Denmark's foreign minister has summoned the top US diplomat in the country over intelligence reports that US citizens have been conducting covert influence operations in Greenland. Sounds a bit odd, but these days are. Now, at least 3 people said to have connections to Donald Trump's administration are said to have been working to infiltrate the semi-autonomous territory to promote its secession from Denmark to the US. This comes from Danish public broadcaster DR, citing sources. Now, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, Denmark's foreign minister, said in a statement, "We are aware that foreign actors continue to show an interest in Greenland and its position in the Kingdom of Denmark." Then he went on, without naming the individuals involved, he said, "It is therefore not surprising if we experience outside attempts to influence the future of the kingdom in the time ahead." Now, you may remember Donald Trump has said several times that he wants to annex Greenland. It's a semi-autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And on a visit there a few months ago, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, she said that the US warned the US, you cannot annex another country. So tensions are quite heated over this. Now, as part of this alleged covert operation, one of the unnamed people allegedly compiled a list of US-friendly Greenlanders, collected names of people opposed to Mr. Trump, and got locals to point out issues or cases that could be used to cast Denmark in a bad light in the American media. Now, 2 others are said to have tried to nurture contacts with politicians, business people and locals, according to the report. Now, that last bit, those other 2, I mean, we need more detail on that. Just trying to nurture contacts with politicians, business people and locals. That's kind of what we do. And it's what lobbyists do. So a bit more detail, please, there, Denmark. Anyway, Danish intelligence has warned that Greenland was being targeted by various kinds of influence campaigns that were trying to, quote, create discord in the relationship between Denmark and Greenland. Washington obviously has repeatedly expressed an interest in expanding its existing military presence on the island. It works as, among other things, a ballistic missile warning base. They want to install radars to monitor the waters between Greenland, Iceland and Britain. The Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, as it's known, it's a gateway for Russian naval vessels, in particular submarines coming out of Murmansk trying to get into the North Atlantic. So not all is smooth in the diplomatic waters, Francis.
Well, no, they certainly aren't. And thanks, Dom. We've been waiting now several days for updates on what was discussed behind closed doors between Ukraine, coalition of the willing countries, and the United States after that extraordinary meeting in Washington last Monday. Well, more details are trickling through, which I'm going to focus on today. So I reported last week how Elbridge Colby, US Defense Undersecretary for Policy, had told officials America will only play a minimal role in security guarantees for Ukraine, despite the $100 billion offer from Kyiv and Europe to purchase weapons in exchange. Some senior White House officials rejected that, saying it was up to the president and that Colby was essentially briefing above his station. But clearly, there are more advanced conversations taking place at the moment, with our friends at the Financial Times publishing a long read which says that the US has pledged it is prepared to provide intelligence assets and battlefield oversight to any Western security plan for post-war Ukraine and take part in a European-led air defence shield for the country, according to European and Ukrainian officials. To quote the piece, senior US officials have since told European counterparts in multiple discussions that Washington would be prepared to contribute strategic enablers, including intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, command and control and air defence assets to enable any European-led deployment on the ground. The coalition of the willing, led by the UK and France, has vowed to protect post-war Ukraine from any future Russian aggression. But European officials have privately admitted that any deployment could only take place with US support to enable, oversee and protect European troops. Washington already supplies Ukraine with Patriot air defence missiles, but the post-war support would involve US aircraft, logistics and ground-based radar supporting and enabling a European-enforced no-fly zone and air shield for the country, the officials said. But perhaps here is the most interesting bit. The US offer, voiced in a flurry of meetings between national security officials and military leaders from the US and major European countries in recent days, is contingent on commitments by European capitals to deploy tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine. It could be rescinded, they said, but it represents a significant shift in stance from the Trump administration, which earlier this year ruled out any US participation in protecting post-conflict Ukraine and has buoyed European officials who have spent months lobbying Washington to lend more support to Kyiv. And the piece concludes by saying Western capitals have sketched out a rough plan that it would involve a demilitarized zone, possibly patrolled by neutral peacekeeping troops from a third country, agreed by Ukraine and Russia. A far more robust border behind that would be defended by European troops armed and trained by NATO militaries. A European-led deterrence force would then be stationed deeper as a third line of defence, with US assets supporting that from the rear. Now, apparently, Andriy Yermak, the Ukrainian president's chief of staff, of course, later confirmed the Financial Times' reporting and said that each country in the coalition would contribute differently and, quote, in the end, the picture will be a mix of military, political and economic support. And discussions apparently revolve around 4 to 5 European brigades on the ground, provided by the coalition of the willing, plus strategic enablers from the US. Yermak said that is a big change from the spring. Indeed, the last meeting in the White House has made a breakthrough, he said, in a number of things, brought in clarity in terms of steps like forming the setting of a security guarantee and purveyance of US weapons for Ukraine's defence through European financial instruments. The US can provide the backbone that makes the whole security and deterrence architecture work, he said. Now, understandably, there's been a lot of scepticism that the US would go this far, and it is right that we ask very serious questions about how meaningful this offer really is. As we've discussed countless times, the European dependency on the US is a tragic indictment, really, of its own security capabilities eroded over the decades, and it's correct to continue underscoring that vulnerability. But if this is true, it would perhaps be enough of a guarantee for the Europeans and the Ukrainians that a peace could hold. And yet, as we've raised before, all this conversation, one could argue, actually makes peace less likely, as it signals the degree of Russian failure to achieve its maximalist objectives in Ukraine and the likelihood they would never achieve them. Strategically, the first step has to be for Europe to define how it wants to see this war end, and then make political or military moves which would compel the Russians to shift position. But Europe has still, 3.5 years since the invasion, seemingly not been able to reach an answer to that question. And opportunities were missed. When one steps back, it's quite extraordinary that the Kremlin has been able to shape the window of discourse to such a degree that the concept of Ukraine's allies placing a few hundred European troops in the west of Ukraine now would be considered a dangerous escalation. When Moscow was able to bring in thousands of North Korean soldiers to fight on European soil without any significant response. As we've said so many times, evidence shows that to try and de-escalate when it comes to Russia is often simply an invitation for them to escalate. And the Kremlin continues to be up to its old tricks now that the dust has settled from Alaska and they have banked their win. We've had Sergei Lavrov telling NBC on Ukrainian Independence Day on Sunday that they do not recognise Zelensky as someone they can do deals with. Quote, "When we come to a stage when you have to sign documents, we would need a very clear understanding by everybody that the person who is signing is legitimate and Mr. Zelensky is not at the moment." Now, I'll come to Dom in a moment about this progress from the United States, if indeed we can articulate it as such. But first, just to bring together a few other strands related to this, Zelensky posted a couple of hours ago about a conversation he had with Finland's Alexander Stubb, sometimes pronounced Stubb here. "A very good conversation," Zelensky said, "as always. We are coordinating our positions to deliver more substantial results. Our teams are actively preparing the architecture of strong and multilateral security guarantees with everyone involved, Europeans, Americans, and our other partners in the coalition of the willing. Military commanders, defence ministers and security advisors at different levels are preparing the components of future security. We're accelerating the process of defining the details. It is already time to organise the format for the leaders' discussions to determine the key priorities and timelines. An important area is relations with the US, ensuring maximum substance in these relations. Unfortunately, the Russians are currently sending negative signals regarding meetings and further developments. Strikes on our cities and villages continue. Every day there are new victims. The Russians will only react to real pressure in response to all of this. Pressure is needed. We are counting on it. Concrete steps are needed. Alex, thank you for your constructive approach and advice, and I'll be very glad to welcome you on a visit to Kyiv." Now, as we talked about last week, Alexander Stubb, who has a very good relationship with Trump, is seen now as a key player in conversations with the Trump administration. And thank you to everyone who's written in to say how much you valued the interview I did with the commander of the Finnish Army we played in last Thursday's episode. I agree with you when you say that he's one of the most candid and in many ways impressive military figures we've interviewed over the years. And I'll link again in the episode description for those of you who are keen to hear that and may have missed it. Another key player who is seemingly becoming more involved in European affairs for understandable political reasons given recent events is Mark Carney, Canada's new leader. He was in Ukraine over the weekend, and his defence minister has since said that Canada would be ready to send troops to Ukraine after the war, if needed. pushing back on concerns that the Ukrainian armed forces are overstretched. Now, for our listeners in Canada, it would be very interesting to know how much cut-through this story got. Do you see it as being politically possible that Canadian troops would be deployed in Ukraine, given the anxieties about the evolving US position? It is quite an announcement for them to say that. Yet the policy of Ukraine's close allies is still predicated on Washington being a guarantor. But will it ever play that role under this administration? For the pessimists, Trump's televised cabinet meeting yesterday offered plenty of evidence that nothing has really changed. It was quite an extraordinary thing to watch, with each member of the cabinet lauding the president for his achievements. Steve Witkoff said this: "There is only one thing I wish for, that the Nobel Committee finally gets its act together and recognises you are the single finest candidate since this Nobel Award was ever talked about to receive this award." And Trump cited Putin as someone whose plaudits were worth recording. "We did a great job with COVID," Trump said, "and never got the credit for it. Operation Warp Speed, people say, is one of the greatest achievements ever in politics or in the military. Everybody, including Putin, said, 'What you did with that, nobody could believe it.' And when pushed on Ukraine, he said, 'Zelensky is not exactly innocent either. It takes two to tango.'" There's also a report in Reuters that US and Russian government officials discussed several energy deals on the sidelines of negotiations this month, including the possibility of ExxonMobil re-entering Russia's oil and gas project, and Russia purchasing US equipment for its LNG projects, which are currently under Western sanctions. So as ever, America presents a mixed picture. But will it ever be otherwise? And if not, what shifts must Europe make to force Russia's and perhaps Trump's hand? So that's where we are in the diplomatic realm. Dom, very interested in your reflections on that Financial Times story and how realistic you think that prospect might be.
Thanks, Francis. I don't think it's remotely realistic. I don't think the US are going to be offering any kind of guarantees for the air package, whatever it might look like. I'm talking about, I can't remember what words they're using, but no, I don't think they will. Let's have a look at what we're talking about with air power very briefly. I mean, NATO has a number of what they call air policing missions at the moment, which you'll hear reports every now and again of fighters put up to, a bit like what, as we reported earlier, but put up to escort or shadow Russian aircraft that are getting too close to Scotland or the Baltic Sea or what have you. So NATO air policing is a standing commitment there. NATO actually owns some of its own aircraft. I think it has 5 Global Hawk drones. Now, I don't know what the tasking mechanism is for those, whether or not Mark Rutte could just decide to go and use those and the other assets that is NATO's sovereign capability, i.e. not contributing nations' capability. And I wonder if the US or maybe SACEUR would have to, well, he'd have to authorise it, but I wonder how far that is a NATO decision. Anyway, if you're in NATO, if you are SACEUR, please let me know. Could NATO use its Global Hawks and other capabilities without the say-so of the US? But, back onto the air package, you'll remember some months ago there was this idea going around of Sky Shield. Now, what the hell Sky Shield was, nobody ever really knew, but this is supposed to reassure Ukraine and deter Russia. I don't think it was ever close to doing either of those things. I think this was the idea that NATO aircraft based in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, etc., could launch and go and fly over Western Ukraine or over any other part of Ukraine to give that presence, that air presence. Never really reassured Ukraine because they weren't certain if there was deterioration in any post-conflict relationship with Russia, those jets could just turn around and go and land back in Romania and Bulgaria and elsewhere, be perfectly safe. So Sky Shield never really did what it was supposed to do. And so they came back to this idea that NATO contributing nations, Western allies and partners of Ukraine, have to put men and women in harm's way, have to put boots on the ground, because it's not so easy to suddenly whisk them away at a moment's notice if it all goes bendy. So Sky Shield, which I know some people said it might be what the Friends of Israel did in some of those missile attacks from Iran and drone attacks like the RF flying out of Akrotiri and all the rest of it, shooting down drones, a question I've asked many government minister, why are you prepared to do that for Israel and not for Ukraine? Never really get an answer, but I think we know what the answer is. Anyway, so whatever Sky Shield was, never got off the ground, no pun intended. And this talk now of a no-fly zone, well, I mean, that's straight out of the top locker. I mean, that is a very, very aggressive action. People think a no-fly zone is a nice, calm, ordered, peaceful action with a few friendly jets stooging around, burning little holes in the sky, being all nice and non-aggressive. No, a no-fly zone is a hugely aggressive act, because do you accept any threat to those aircraft whatsoever? There'll be a sliding scale of answers on that. But if the answer is veering towards the no side, then any radar that paints one of those friendly jets, whether that radar is inside Russia or inside occupied Ukraine, that's got to go. So generally, the first thing that happens when you impose a no-fly zone is that you start plinking targets on the ground. It's a very, very aggressive act. Now, what are the rules of engagement for any no-fly zone? If there was a threat to these jets or anything else, if there were Russian aircraft in the sky, are they suddenly, how far do they have to, is there an incursion? How far do they have to get before they are legitimately attacked? So to go from sort of nothing and Sky Shield was mooted and then fell apart, to then go, right, I'll tell you what, it'll be a US backstop, guaranteed air power, and a no-fly zone. I mean, it's not a step down. A no-fly zone is a hugely aggressive action. So I just can't see at the moment any real skin on the bone of these ideas. I think we're still casting around. I hope there's conversations happening behind closed doors to really come up with some answers on this. But from what we're seeing from these public pronouncements and the mood music from the politicians, no, the US are disinterested. They might withdraw their surveillance support, which is why I'm wondering about the Global Hawks and elsewhere from NATO. Yeah, but I can't see anyone at the moment stepping up and saying, yeah, I'll tell you what, let's start with what would a no-fly zone look like and start apportioning combat power against that and see who can do what. I mean, that's right in the deep end of the application of air power. So I'm afraid, Francis, I'm in the pessimistic group.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, for your reflections. Speaking of aircraft, let's go over to our Berlin correspondent now. James, welcome back to the podcast as ever. A few stories have caught your eye, and we're going to give an update on one that I know listeners have been writing in about. But first of all, what's the top story that you want to lead on?
Thanks, Francis. I'll start with two stories related to the Baltic Sea, first of all, and then I'll end with the best of the lot about Warhammer. For podcast listeners may recall that we did a story about Ukraine and Warhammer quite recently, or at least we put out a sort of appeal to our listeners to help us out with the story, and that's now come out. So we'll be talking about that in just a moment. Francis, two really interesting kind of espionage or espionage adjacent stories have come out in Germany recently. The first involves an incident yesterday. We don't know when exactly, but yesterday German fighter jets were scrambled to intercept a Russian aircraft, which appears possibly to have been taking part in some kind of surveillance activity. According to Deutsche Welle, a German broadcaster, two Eurofighter jets took off from the Rostock Lager base, that's in northern Germany, just by the Baltic Sea, and was scrambled to intercept, as I said, a very suspicious Russian aircraft that was flying over the Baltic with its transponders turned off and with no flight plan submitted, which of course made NATO's air command a little bit suspicious. That's all we know about that incident for now, Francis, but the Baltic Sea, of course, is a very, very sensitive area geopolitically. It was also, if we zoom down now from the air to the sea, the scenes of some sabotage attacks on undersea cables suspected to have been carried out by, well, it's a bit murky who did it exactly, but the suspicion lies primarily with Russia and interestingly enough, China. So it's an area where there's been a lot of, you might say, geopolitical sensitivities. It's a bit of a front, you might say, in that hybrid war that we've talked about many times, that attempt to sabotage and to disrupt the West as revenge for the West support of Ukraine. So we might have a bit of an update on what exactly happened in that incident later on, Francis, but that's the main sort of moving security or geopolitical incident, you might say, today. Let's also just touch briefly on a really fascinating ongoing criminal trial, which relates to the plot to blow up the Nord Stream gas pipeline. As our listeners may well be aware, there has been quite a high-profile arrest involving this case. Sergei Kuznetsov, 49, was arrested in Italy and appeared in court last week in Bologna, accused of being basically one of a team of Ukrainian operatives who allegedly blew up the Nord Stream gas pipeline by renting a yacht, posing as civilians, taking it out to the pipeline, diving down, attaching explosives, and blowing it up. And this court case, Francis, is going to get really interesting. He was arrested in Italy at the request of German investigators on a European arrest warrant, and they want to extradite this suspect back to Germany, where he can be put on trial for blowing up the Nord Stream gas pipeline. This is the only arrest to be made in this fascinating and rather murky case so far. But Mr. Kuznetsov has vowed to resist the attempt to extradite him. So there's going to be a hearing in Italy again on September the 3rd. We may find out at that hearing whether or not this suspect is going to be extradited back to Germany. If he is extradited back to Germany, and if the Germans charge him with blowing up Nord Stream, that's going to be not just a fascinating court case, but it's going to be quite difficult politically and diplomatically, I would argue, for the relationship between Berlin and Kyiv. That relationship, as you know, Francis, has gotten much better over the last couple of years. But when the Nord Stream pipeline incident happened back in late 2022, the relationship was not great. So we'll see what happens with that, Francis. I think it's a really interesting court case, and we'll definitely be bringing our listeners more updates on that. And finally, shall we talk a little bit about Warhammer?
Let's do it.
Wonderful. Well, some listeners will remember a couple of weeks ago we talked on a podcast about this incident that we've been made aware of, an incident where Games Workshop, which is the British creator of Warhammer, a tabletop fighting game which Ukrainian soldiers love to get stuck into, it came to our attention that Games Workshop had pulled out of a deal to provide Ukrainian translations of the novels which are set in this grimdark science fiction fantasy universe. And at the time, Francis, as you'll remember, we were looking to speak to some soldiers because we know that this hobby tabletop game is really close to their heart. And I want to say thank you very much to callsign Shekel, a Ukrainian Special Forces sergeant who we're of course not going to identify beyond that, who got in touch with us quite recently and gave us some really, really interesting quotes and context and reaction to that decision by Games Workshop. And he revealed most colourfully of all that Ukrainian soldiers are so cross about this decision to take away their Ukrainian translations of novels set in this fantasy universe that Games Workshop has been branded by them, he said, Wankers Workshop, using a Ukrainian slang, which I've sort of slightly freely translated there myself, and with some help from some Ukrainian speakers on the team as Wankers Workshop. So Ukrainian soldiers, Francis, really upset with Games Workshop over taking away their Ukrainian translations. And one of the things that Shekel explained to us, which is really important context, is that he was saying before this deal where Ukrainian troops could read the novels set in their favourite fantasy universe in Ukrainian, they had to rely on bootlegged Russian translations. And before 2014 wasn't the end of the world. They were pirate translations. They weren't great. And of course, they were Russian, not the language of Ukraine, but they put up with it. Since the war, of course, they absolutely don't want to be reading. They absolutely don't want to be reading Russian language translations. And so it's a real kick in the nuts, frankly, for these soldiers, because the end of this deal basically means they've got to read their Warhammer novels in the language of their enemy, which, is just not on from their perspective. So, Francis, the full version of that story is up there on the website for all to read. And, listeners who are passionate about this, please do get in touch with us if you hear on the grapevine any updates on this case, particularly if you want to share any stories with us of how Warhammer has supported Ukrainian veterans. I think we're actually working on a story that zooms in on that issue this week. Please do get in touch. And that's probably the main three items I would say from Germany, Francis.
Well, thank you very much, James. I'm so pleased we've been able to pursue this story, and credit to you for all of your work on this, and of course those listeners who've reached out. As we said before, David wouldn't have forgiven us if we didn't pursue this story because he was himself a massive Warhammer fan. So let's go to our final thoughts now. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners today?
Thanks, Francis. So there's a fascinating article in the Kyiv Independent that says the number of HIV and hepatitis cases among Russian soldiers is on the rise. It seems that Moscow may be deliberately recruiting sick people and actively looking for them to go into the military. Now, there's a report by Carnegie Politica, that's part of the Carnegie Centre, that says the number of HIV cases detected in the Russian armed forces increased 13 times by the end of 2022 and 20 times higher by the end of 2023 compared to the start of the full-scale invasion. Now, they accept several factors at play here: blood transfusions for wounded soldiers, reusing syringes in field hospitals, and also the soldiers engaging in drug use and unprotected sex. But under Russian law, people living with HIV, tuberculosis or hepatitis C should be exempt from military service. But since the start of the full-scale invasion, independent Russian media have reported that HIV-positive individuals continue to receive draft notices, either because military officials are unaware of their health status or because they simply don't care. Now, we know that to replenish the military ranks, Russia is recruiting prisoners with infectious diseases, as well as obviously residents of Russian-occupied territories, so they don't have the means of getting away from the draft. But the report quotes Olya Romanova, an exiled Russian journalist and founder of the NGO Russia Behind Bars, who says that there's effectively no formal mobilization process in Russia, as we've reported, but effectively everyone's being recruited by other means. She says they basically take everyone indiscriminately because it's unofficially approved, because no one is planning to treat them at all. It's easier for everyone if they just get killed. No one will notice the difference. Anyway, it's a very interesting deep dive in the Kyiv Independent, and we've put the link in the episode notes.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.